They laughed when he bought the fat bride. The whole town did. Every man, every woman, mocking the quiet rancher who paid $1 silver for a woman no one wanted. But when the laughter faded and the dust settled, something began to change. Out on that lonely stretch of Colorado land, the woman they called worthless started to rebuild everything: his home, his faith, and the heart of a town torn by pride. While others saw shame, she saw purpose. When they mocked her kindness, she answered with mercy. And when a hidden truth from her past rose from the grave, it threatened to take everything: his land, his name, even their fragile hope. The snows are coming, the church bells ringing, and this time, it's not laughter echoing through town. It's fear, faith, and something like a miracle. How could the woman everyone laughed at become the one who saves them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The spring air held a bite of morning frost as Jack Boone guided his horse through the familiar streets of Silver Creek. The livestock auction wouldn't start for another hour, but punctuality had been drilled into him during his cavalry days. His worn boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk as he made his way to register his steer. The town was already stirring, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts and women hanging fresh laundry on lines strung between buildings. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the bakery, mixing with the earthier smells of horses and hay from the livery stable. Jack touched the brim of his hat as he passed Mrs. Henderson outside the general store. She gave him a sympathetic smile, the kind he'd grown used to since Sarah's passing 2 winters ago. Everyone in town seemed to look at him that way now, their eyes full of pity for the widowed rancher who lived alone on the edge of town. The auction yard was beginning to fill as he arrived. Jack led his steer to the holding pen, noting how the animal's coat gleamed in the morning sun. He'd spent extra time grooming it, knowing a well-presented animal would fetch a better price. The money would help see him through until the spring cattle drive. "Morning, Boone," Tom Wilson, the auctioneer, called out. "Fine-looking steer you've got there." Jack nodded, not one for unnecessary words. He found a spot along the fence where he could observe the proceedings, preferring to stand apart from the growing crowd of ranchers and traders. The familiar sounds of cattle lowing and men haggling filled the air, but something was different today. A group of women had gathered near the auction platform, led by Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife. The morning progressed with the usual business of livestock trading. Jack's steer sold for a fair price, the silver dollars now weighing comfortably in his pocket. He was about to head home when Mrs. Patterson stepped onto the platform, her voice cutting through the general din. "Good people of Silver Creek," she announced. "As you know, we've arranged for some fine young women to come west, seeking honest Christian marriages." She gestured to a line of women standing quietly behind her, each clutching small carpet bags or worn valises. "These ladies have traveled far, leaving behind everything they knew, hoping to find good husbands and build new lives here in our territory." Jack shifted uncomfortably, sensing the crowd's mood changing. The men pressed closer, eyeing the women like they might inspect cattle. One by one, the women were introduced, and one by one, they were claimed by local men who stepped forward with eager smiles and promised marriages. At last, only one remained. She stood alone, her hands twisting the fabric of her worn dress. Jack noticed how she tried to make herself smaller, shoulders hunched against the scrutiny of the crowd. Her bonnet, already damaged by the spring winds, did little to hide her round face or the nervous trembling of her chin. "This here is Mabel Ruth," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying a note of desperate cheerfulness. "She's 23 years old, comes from good Kansas stock, knows her letters and figures, and is well-versed in household management." The silence that followed was cruel in its completeness. Then someone sniggered, and another voice called out, "Looks like she's well versed in emptying the pantry, too." Laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh and mean-spirited. Mabel Ruth's face flushed deep red, but she held her ground, though Jack could see tears gathering in her eyes. The sight stirred something in him. Memories of Sarah, perhaps, or simply the basic decency his parents had instilled in him. Before he could think better of it, his hand was in the air. "$1 silver," he called out, his voice steady despite the sudden pounding of his heart. The laughter grew louder. "Jack Boone's bought himself the fat bride," someone shouted, triggering more cruel jeers. Jack ignored them all, pushing through the crowd until he reached the platform. Mabel Ruth stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperate hope. He held out his hand to her, noticing how her fingers trembled as she placed her hand in his. "Ma'am," he said quietly, helping her down from the platform. He gathered her small carpet bag with his free hand, conscious of how the crowd parted before them, their mockery following like a shadow. Mrs. Patterson hurried after them, clutching a Bible and some papers. "Mr. Boone, we'll need to make this official." "Later," Jack said firmly, continuing to guide Mabel Ruth through the crowd. He led her to where his horse waited, the animal standing patient in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. The sun was settling toward the horizon by the time they'd signed the necessary papers in Mrs. Patterson's parlor. Jack helped Mabel Ruth mount his horse, noting how she struggled to settle, herself side-saddle, her face flaming with embarrassment. He adjusted the stirrup for her before swinging up behind her, trying to maintain a respectful distance despite the intimacy of their shared saddle. They rode in silence through the sage-dotted landscape, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the whisper of the wind through the brush, and the distant toll of the church bell marking the end of day. The spring air had grown cooler, and Jack felt Mabel Ruth shiver slightly. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened at first, then relaxed slightly, pulling the warm fabric closer around herself. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken to him directly. Jack simply nodded, though she couldn't see it. The sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold as they rode on. Two strangers bound together by a single silver dollar and whatever mercy God might grant them in the days to come. The sagebrush cast long shadows across their path, and jackrabbits occasionally darted through the scrub, startled by their passing. The familiar landmarks of his property began to appear. The lightning-struck oak that marked his eastern boundary, the stone cairn he'd built to honor Sarah's memory, the crooked fence post he'd been meaning to fix. As they crested the final rise, his ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A sturdy 2-room cabin with a lean-to kitchen, a barn that needed fresh paint, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden surrounded by a rail fence. But it was home, built with his own hands and Sarah's dreams, and now he was bringing another woman to live within its walls. The horse's hooves crunched on the gravel as they approached the cabin. The windows were dark, no welcoming lamp lit inside. Jack felt Mabel Ruth's tension in the way she held herself, rigid and uncertain. He remembered his own mother's teachings about hospitality and regretted not having someone ride ahead to prepare the house for a bride. He helped her down from the horse, noting how she winced slightly at the movement, unused to riding, no doubt. Her carpetbag looked pitifully small in the growing darkness, containing everything she owned in the world. The reality of what he'd done, the responsibility he'd taken on with that impulsive bid, settled heavy on his shoulders. The distant church bell tolled once more, its sound carrying clearly across the open range, marking the complete fall of night, Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to its mate. Jack cleared his throat. "It ain't much," he said, gesturing to the cabin, "but it's dry and warm." Mabel Ruth clutched her bag closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure it's fine, Mr. Boone." "Jack," he corrected gently. "Reckon you should call me Jack, being as we're—" He trailed off, uncertain how to complete that sentence. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "Yes, Jack." The wind picked up, causing her torn bonnet to flutter. She reached up to hold it in place, and in that movement, Jack caught a glimpse of the woman beneath the fear and shame. Someone used to making do, to holding on despite the storm. He led the horse to the barn, gesturing for her to wait by the cabin door. Inside the barn, as he removed the saddle and began brushing down his mount, he offered up a silent prayer, for guidance, for wisdom, and for the trembling woman waiting in the darkness, who'd trusted her life to a stranger with a single silver dollar and a moment of mercy. When he returned to the cabin, Mabel Ruth hadn't moved from where he'd left her. She stood like a statue in the darkness, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, her carpetbag clutched like a shield. The sight stirred something protective in his chest, reminding him of wounded creatures he'd found on the range, frightened but fighting to survive. The day's events hung between them like an unspoken question, but Jack knew some questions didn't need immediate answers. Sometimes, like with skittish horses, the best approach was patience and quiet kindness. He reached past her to open the cabin door, the familiar creak of its hinges seeming unusually loud in the evening quiet. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boone," he said softly, and struck a match to light the lamp, bringing warmth and light to the darkness that had waited within. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues as Jack and Mabel continued their journey. The horse's steady gait couldn't disguise Mabel's discomfort. She shifted constantly, unused to such long hours in the saddle. Jack noticed but kept silent, respecting her dignity by not drawing attention to her struggle. After about an hour of riding, the sound of running water caught their attention. A small creek cut through the landscape, its clear waters reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Jack guided the horse to the bank. "Might be good to rest a spell," he said quietly, bringing the horse to a halt. "Creek's clean here." Mabel nodded gratefully, but said nothing as Jack helped her down. Her legs trembled beneath her skirts, and she took a moment to steady herself against the horse's flank. The memory of the townspeople's laughter still burned in her chest, making each breath feel tight and painful. Jack busied himself with his saddlebags, pulling out a battered tin pot and some coffee. He kept his movements deliberately slow, giving Mabel time to compose herself. When he glanced over, she had made her way to the creek's edge, kneeling carefully on a flat rock. The water felt cool and refreshing as Mabel cupped it in her hands, washing away the dust and tears from her face. Her reflection wavered in the rippling surface, a round face, plain features, nothing like the pretty brides the other men had chosen. She splashed more water on her cheeks, trying to wash away the shame along with the trail, dust. Behind her, Jack had a small fire going, the coffee pot nestled in the coals. The familiar aroma of brewing coffee drifted on the evening breeze. "Coffee's hot," he offered, holding out a tin cup in her direction. "No, thank you kindly," Mabel replied softly, her voice barely carrying over the creek's gentle burble. She couldn't bring herself to take anything more from this man who'd already shown her more kindness than she deserved. Jack accepted her refusal with a simple nod, drinking the coffee himself as they rested. The twilight deepened around them, bringing with it the first evening stars and the distant cry of a whippoorwill. When they mounted up again, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the prairie. The horse knew the way home, picking its path carefully through the sage and scrub. Mabel's body ached fiercely now, but she held herself as still as possible, not wanting to burden Jack with her discomfort. It was fully dark when they finally approached the ranch. In the moonlight, Mabel could make out the shape of a modest cabin, its weathered boards silver gray in the darkness. A barn stood off to one side, its door slightly ajar, and a few other outbuildings clustered nearby. It wasn't much, but to Mabel's tired eyes, it looked like shelter. Jack helped her down from the horse, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. "House ain't much," he said, a note of apology in his voice, "but it's solid. Built it myself." Mabel gathered her courage, looking up at him directly for the first time since the auction. "Mr. Boone, Jack, I won't take your bed, or your late wife's place. Please, the barn will do fine for me." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. "Ma'am, you can't sleep in the barn. Wouldn't be proper." "I won't displace a ghost," Mabel said firmly, her voice stronger now. "Some things need time and respect. The barn will suit me fine tonight." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because after a long moment, Jack nodded. He disappeared into the house, returning with a clean blanket and a lantern. "At least take these," he said, holding them out. "Nights get cold still." Mabel accepted the items with a murmured thank you, then made her way to the barn. The familiar smell of hay and livestock wrapped around her like a comfort, reminding her of her father's farm in Kansas. She found a clean spot in the hayloft, spread the blanket, and knelt to pray. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "I know I'm not much to look at, not much to offer, but please help me prove my worth here. Help me be useful, be good. Show me how to make this work." Her prayers continued, whispered into the hay until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. Inside the cabin, Jack sat in his chair, studying the photograph that hung on the wall. Sarah smiled back at him, forever young and beautiful in the faded image. The lantern light caught the glass, reflecting his own tired face back at him. "What made me do it, Sarah?" he asked softly. "Was it remembering how your pa gave me a chance when nobody else would? Or maybe just couldn't stand to see someone treated that way?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Don't rightly know what happens next." The photograph offered no answers, just Sarah's gentle smile. Jack finally blew out the lantern and lay down on his bed, fully clothed. Sleep was long in coming, his mind too full of questions about what the morning would bring. He needn't have worried. The first gray light of dawn found Mabel already at work. She'd located the milk pail and made friends with the cow, her capable hands working in a steady rhythm as she filled the bucket with warm milk. Her back ached from the previous day's ride, but the familiar task brought comfort. After storing the milk in the spring house, she'd discovered Jack's work shirt hanging on a nail, the sleeve torn at the shoulder. With thread from her carpet bag, she'd mended it neat as new, the tiny stitches barely visible in the sturdy fabric. Now it hung on the fence rail, waiting for its owner to find it. Jack stepped out of the cabin just as the sun cleared the horizon, stopping short at the sight of the fresh milk cooling in the spring house and his mended shirt hanging in the morning breeze. He picked up the shirt, examining the neat stitching with calloused fingers. Inside the barn, Mabel heard his footsteps and quickly busied herself with straightening her makeshift bed, not wanting to face him just yet. But she could hear him moving around, taking care of the morning chores she hadn't yet gotten to. The morning light streamed through the barn's weathered boards, catching the dust motes in golden beams. Mabel smoothed her skirts and patted her hair into place, gathering her courage. She might not be beautiful, might not be what anyone would choose, but she knew how to work, how to care for things, how to make herself useful. She emerged from the barn to find Jack building up the cooking fire in the outdoor pit. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the morning light. "Saw to the milk," she said quietly, "and mended your shirt. Hope you don't mind." Jack nodded slowly. "Much obliged," he said. "Wasn't expecting—" "I know what people see when they look at me," Mabel interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "But I know my worth isn't in how I look. It's in what I can do, what I can give." She gestured to the ranch around them. "I can work, can cook and clean and mend, can help make this place prosper if you'll let me." Jack studied her for a long moment, seeing past the plain features to the quiet strength beneath. The morning sun caught the threads of gray in her dark hair, the capable hands clasped at her waist, the determined set of her chin. This wasn't a woman looking for charity or ease. This was someone who understood the value of work, of making things better by careful tending. "Reckon we could both use some breakfast," he said finally. "Kitchen's through here." It wasn't much of a welcome, but Mabel understood what wasn't being said. She followed him toward the cabin, ready to begin whatever this new day might bring. The morning sun warmed her back, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's lone window, catching dust motes in its pale beam. Jack stood at his rough-hewn table, watching as Mabel moved carefully around his kitchen. Her hands were sure and steady as she worked with the meager supplies she'd found: cornmeal, salt pork, and the fresh milk she'd gathered earlier. The familiar scent of frying cornbread filled the small space, and Jack's stomach rumbled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday's noon meal. He cleared his throat, searching for words to thank her for the morning's work, but they stuck somehow. "Ma'am, Miss Ruth," he began, his voice rough from disuse. Mabel turned from the cook stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just Mabel is fine," she said quietly. "Or Mrs. Boone, if you prefer, though I haven't earned that yet." Jack nodded, still struggling with what to say. "The shirt and the milk. I'm much obliged." She only nodded in response, her eyes already scanning the cabin's interior. "Would you happen to have a broom?" she asked. "And perhaps some soap?" "Under the sink," he replied, gesturing to the rough cabinet beneath the dry sink. "Ain't much, but there's lye soap and an old broom." Mabel retrieved both items without comment, though Jack noticed how her capable hands tested the broom's bristles, assessing its usefulness. She served him breakfast first: golden cornbread with fresh butter and thick slices of salt pork, before taking a modest portion for herself. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against tin plates and the morning sounds filtering in from outside: roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distant pasture, the whisper of prairie wind through the eaves. Jack watched as Mabel took small, careful bites, her eyes downcast, as if trying to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. As soon as she finished eating, Mabel rose and began clearing away the breakfast things. Jack started to protest. He was used to leaving dishes till evening, but something in her quiet efficiency stopped him. Instead, he pushed back his chair and headed outside to tend to the morning's work. Through the cabin's window, he could hear her humming as she worked. Old hymns his mother used to sing, their familiar melodies carrying clearly in the morning air. Amazing Grace gave way to What a Friend We Have in Jesus as she attacked the hearth with brush and soap, scrubbing away years of accumulated ash and grime. By mid-morning, Jack had to come in for his forgotten work gloves. He paused in the doorway, struck by the transformation taking place. Mabel had opened the window wide, letting in fresh air and sunshine. The floor had been swept clean. The cobwebs were gone from the corners, and the hearthstones gleamed with a brightness he hadn't seen since Mary had been alive. Mabel looked up from her work, a smudge of ash on her cheek. "Your gloves are on the peg by the door," she said softly. "I found them under the chair and hung them up." Jack nodded his thanks, unable to find words for how the simple act of caring for his things affected him. He took the gloves and returned to his work, the sound of her quiet humming following him out. Around noon, he looked up from mending fence to see her in the chicken yard, scattering feed and speaking softly to the hens. They clustered around her skirts, pecking contentedly as she addressed each one as Miss or Ma'am, as if they were ladies at a social gathering. Despite himself, Jack felt the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. After the midday meal, fresh bread and beans she'd found soaking in the pantry, Mabel walked out into the afternoon sunshine. Jack watched from the barn as she climbed the gentle slope behind the house, her steps slowing as she neared the top. He knew what she would find there, and something tightened in his chest. The small wooden cross stood alone against the prairie sky, weathered by sun and wind, but still standing straight and true. Jack had cut the wood himself, carved the letters with careful precision. Mary Boone, beloved wife, gone to glory. The prairie grass grew thick around its base, dotted now with early spring wildflowers. Mabel stood before the cross for a long moment, her head bowed. Then, slowly, she knelt in the grass. Jack couldn't hear her words from this distance, but he could see her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. She gathered a handful of the small purple flowers growing nearby and arranged them carefully at the base of the cross. Something caught in Jack's throat as he watched. He'd thought that particular ache buried deep enough that it couldn't touch him anymore, but seeing Mabel's simple act of respect brought it flooding back. Mary had loved wildflowers, especially the prairie violets that bloomed so briefly each spring. He turned away, blinking hard against the sudden moisture in his eyes. When he looked back, Mabel was making her way down the hill, her movements unhurried and dignified despite her size. She returned to the cabin, and soon smoke rose from the chimney as she began preparing the evening meal. The sun was setting when Jack finally finished his work and returned to the cabin. The interior glowed with lamplight, and savory smells made his stomach remind him how long it had been since noon. Mabel had somehow transformed the last of his salt pork and some dried vegetables into a thick stew, served with the remaining cornbread warmed from breakfast. For the first time since that morning, they sat down at the table together. Jack started to reach for his spoon, but Mabel's quiet voice stopped him. "Shall we ask the blessing?" she asked, her hands folded in her lap. Jack nodded, bowing his head as she spoke. "Dear Lord," Mabel began, her voice soft but clear, "we thank you for this food and for the shelter of this home. We ask your blessing on this meal and on this household. In Jesus' name, amen." The simple prayer hung in the air between them for a moment before Jack mumbled his own amen. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. As darkness settled fully outside, the coyotes began their nightly chorus in earnest. The waxing moon cast silver light through the window, making patterns on the freshly scrubbed floor. Jack watched as Mabel cleared away the supper dishes with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all day. "I'll bed down in the barn again tonight," she said as she dried the last bowl. "Unless you'd rather I didn't?" Jack shook his head. "Barn's fine, if that's what you want. I'll bring you fresh blankets. Nights are still mighty cool." "Thank you," she replied simply. "Good night, then." He watched her cross the yard to the barn, her figure solid and steady in the moonlight. The day's events turned over in his mind, her industry in the morning, her kindness to the chickens, the flowers laid so carefully at Mary's grave. Each small action spoke of a woman who knew the value of work, of respect, of doing what needed doing without complaint or expectation of praise. Inside the cabin, the clean hearth and swept floor testified to her care. The lingering scent of stew and cornbread made the place feel more like a home than it had in years. Jack sat in his chair, listening to the coyotes' song rise and fall across the prairie, and felt something shift inside him. Not the sharp grief he'd carried so long, but something quieter. Something that might, with time, grow into respect or even peace. The moon climbed higher, its light catching the edge of Mary's photograph on the wall. For the first time in a long while, Jack looked at it without that familiar stab of pain. Perhaps Mary herself had guided his hand at the auction, led him to offer dignity to someone who needed it. Perhaps this was part of God's plan, though Jack had long since stopped trying to understand such things. Outside, the coyotes sang to the waxing moon, their wild voices weaving together in ancient harmony. In the barn, Mabel knelt for her evening prayers, thankful for shelter, for work to do, for the chance to prove her worth. And in the cabin, Jack Boone sat in his chair, watching the moon's slow journey across the night sky, feeling the first stirrings of change in the quiet of his heart. The spring morning dawned clear and crisp, dew sparkling on the grass as Mabel fed the chickens. 2 days had passed since she'd first arrived at the ranch, and already the routine of daily chores felt familiar. The hens clucked around her feet as she scattered feed, their feathers gleaming in the early light. Inside the cabin, breakfast dishes were washed and put away. The hearth had been swept clean, and a pot of beans simmered slowly for the midday meal. Jack had ridden out at first light to check on the cattle, leaving Mabel to her tasks. She'd settled into a rhythm of work that felt right, even if her place here still seemed uncertain. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider was coming up the road, his horse's gait too precise to be Jack, returning early. Mabel stepped back toward the cabin porch, watching as the stranger came into view. He rode a sleek bay horse and wore a neat black suit that marked him as a city man. His hat was expensive, and a gold watch chain glinted at his vest. Everything about him spoke of authority and money, the kind that made decisions affecting common folk without much thought for the consequences. The man reined his horse to a stop and surveyed the property with calculating eyes before noticing Mabel. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for Jack Boone. Is he about?" "He's out checking the herd," Mabel replied, keeping her voice steady despite her instinctive dislike of the man's superior manner. "I expect him back before noon." "And you are—" The man's gaze took in her plain dress and work-reddened hands with barely concealed disdain. Mabel hesitated, unsure how to describe her position. "I keep house here." "I see." His tone suggested he saw all too clearly. "Well, when Mr. Boone returns, please inform him that Mr. Harrison from the Western Pacific Railroad Company paid a call. He'll want to speak with me about the new survey." As if summoned by the conversation, Jack appeared on the ridge, riding hard toward the house. He must have seen the stranger from a distance. His face was set in grim lines as he dismounted and strode toward them. "Harrison," he said flatly, "what brings railroad business to my door?" The land agent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Progress, Mr. Boone. Always progress. I've come to discuss the new rail line survey. Perhaps we could step inside?" Jack glanced at Mabel, then nodded curtly. "Much obliged for keeping the coffee hot," he said to her, a clear dismissal. She understood and withdrew to the barn, but left the door ajar. The men's voices carried clearly across the yard. "Your property lies along our proposed route," Harrison was saying. "The survey stakes were placed 2 days ago. Surely you noticed them crossing your south pasture?" "Those stakes cut right through my best grazing land." Jack's voice held barely controlled anger. "You can't just claim whatever ground suits you." "Actually, Mr. Boone, we can. The Railroad Act gives us certain rights regarding underdeveloped land. Without proof of lawful family residence and full agricultural use, portions of this property could be classified as available for acquisition." "This is my land, Harrison. I've worked it for 8 years. I've got the papers to prove it." "Ah, but the law requires more than just papers." Harrison's voice took on an oily smoothness. "A proper homestead needs a family working the land, a wife, children. Otherwise, how can we be sure you're making full use of such a large parcel? The railroad has eminent domain over unused territory." "Get out." Jack's words came out like hammer blows. "Get off my land." "Consider your position carefully, Mr. Boone. You have 1 month to provide proof of family residence, or we'll begin proceedings to claim the required acreage. Good day to you." Harrison's boots clicked across the porch boards. Moments later, his horse's hooves faded down the road. Mabel waited until she was sure he was gone before approaching the cabin. She found Jack standing at the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, making him look older than his years. He turned as she entered, his face troubled. "You heard?" he asked. Mabel nodded. "Most of it. They want to take your land because—" She hesitated. "Because you're alone here?" Jack ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "The law says a homestead needs a family working it. Without that, they can claim parts are unused and seize them for the railroad. They've done it to others." He looked at her directly. "I could lose half the ranch." Mabel moved to the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. She handed one to Jack, who took it automatically. "There must be something that can be done. Papers to file or—" "Papers." Jack's laugh was bitter. Harrison and his railroad lawyers would tie those up in court for years. No, what they want is proof of a proper family farm, a wife, children, a household that shows the land's being fully used. He took a long swallow of coffee. "Without that, they'll take what they want." Mabel sat down at the table, her mind working. "I could help," she said quietly. "With the paperwork, I mean. I can read and write well enough." Jack set his cup down and looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Calculation, possibility, decision. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "but I'd have no right to ask it of you." "Ask what?" He pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "A marriage. In name only," he added quickly. "Just to satisfy the law. You'd have a roof over your head, food on the table. I'd give you a proper wage for your work. But it would mean signing papers, standing before the preacher." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Mabel's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "It would protect the ranch?" "Yes. With a legal wife, they couldn't claim the land was unused. But I won't force such an arrangement on you. You might want to wait for a better offer, a younger man who could give you a real marriage." "I'm not likely to get other offers," Mabel said matter-of-factly, touching her plain dress, acknowledging her size. "And I need a home as much as you need a wife on paper." She met his eyes. "I accept." Jack studied her face, looking for any sign of hesitation. "You're sure? It wouldn't be a true marriage? I loved Mary, and I'm not looking to replace her. But I'd treat you with respect, give you a decent home." "I understand." Mabel's voice was quiet but firm. "When should we go to town?" The preacher makes his circuit tomorrow. We could ride in then, if you're certain." "I am." The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal chores, though nothing felt normal anymore. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. That evening, Mabel stayed in the barn again, lying awake long into the night, wondering if she was doing the right thing. But what choice did either of them have? She needed a home, he needed a wife on paper, and the railroad was circling like a hawk over a rabbit. The next morning dawned gray and cool. They ate breakfast in silence. Then Jack saddled the horse while Mabel changed into her best dress, the one she'd worn for the mail-order bride selection. It was wrinkled from being packed, but clean. She pinned her hair up carefully and put on her bonnet. The ride to town took 2 hours. Jack let her use his saddle while he walked alongside, leading the horse. Neither spoke much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. They were two people doing what needed to be done. Nothing more. The town was quiet when they arrived, most folks being out in their fields or busy with morning work. The preacher was at the small church, preparing for his circuit ride. He looked up as they entered, recognition crossing his face. "Mr. Boone," he said warmly. And he looked questioningly at Mabel. "Miss Ruth," Jack supplied. "We've come to be married, if you're willing." The preacher's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. Do you have witnesses?" "The general store's just opening. I'll fetch Mrs. Miller and her daughter." Jack stepped out, leaving Mabel with the preacher. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" the older man asked kindly. "Marriage is a sacred covenant." "I'm certain," Mabel replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she removed her bonnet. Jack returned with Mrs. Miller, a plump, friendly-looking woman, and her teenage daughter, Sarah. They stood as witnesses while the preacher performed the simple ceremony. Jack and Mabel spoke their vows clearly, though neither looked directly at the other. When it came time to sign the register, Mabel's hand shook slightly as she wrote Mabel Ruth Boone in careful letters. The preacher gave them a copy of the marriage certificate and his blessing. Mrs. Miller hugged Mabel impulsively, whispering, "Welcome to town, dear," in her ear. Then they were outside in the gray morning light, legally man and wife. "We should get some supplies while we're here," Jack said practically, "and file these papers with the land office." They spent the next hour taking care of business, recording the marriage certificate, buying flour and coffee, securing a few yards of calico that Jack insisted Mabel choose for herself. By the time they started home, the sun had burned through the morning clouds. The ride back was as quiet as the journey in had been. But now Mabel wore a plain gold band on her finger, Jack's mother's ring, he'd explained awkwardly, and carried papers that made her legally Mrs. Boone. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. As they approached the ranch, Jack cleared his throat. "I'll move my things to the lean-to behind the cabin," he said. "You should take the house proper. It's not right for a married woman to sleep in the barn." "You don't have to," Mabel began, but he cut her off. "I do. You're my wife now, even if it's just on paper. I aim to treat you proper." They reached the yard, and Jack helped her down from the horse. For a moment they stood looking at each other, two near strangers bound together by necessity and law. Then Jack touched his hat brim and led the horse to the barn, leaving Mabel to enter her new home alone. She stood in the cabin doorway, feeling the weight of the gold ring on her finger. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. She was Mabel Ruth Boone now, a rancher's wife in name if nothing else. She had a home, he had his legal protection, and somewhere out there, the railroad's land agent was about to discover his plans had been thwarted. Squaring her shoulders, Mabel stepped inside and began preparing the midday meal. There was work to be done, whatever name she carried. The beans needed tending, bread wanted baking, and life on the ranch would go on. Different now, but going on all the same. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Jack and Mabel rode back to the ranch. The air felt heavy with coming rain, and a cool wind rustled through the prairie grass. Jack kept glancing at his new wife, still trying to make sense of how this day had turned their lives upside down. She sat straight in the saddle, her face hidden beneath her bonnet, holding the package of calico cloth close. The first fat drops began to fall just as they reached the cabin. Jack helped Mabel down from the horse, then hurried to get the animal settled in the barn. By the time he finished, rain drummed steadily on the roof, and lightning flickered in the distance. Inside the cabin, Mabel stood uncertainly near the door, her bonnet in her hands. Jack moved to the stove, trying to ignore the awkwardness between them. "Best get some supper started," he said, reaching for the bean pot. "You must be hungry after the long ride." "Can I help?" Mabel asked softly. Jack shook his head. "You've had a long day. Rest a spell." He busied himself with the beans and bacon, grateful for something to do with his hands. The familiar tasks helped settle his nerves, measuring the beans, adding water, stoking the fire. Thunder rolled outside as savory smells began filling the cabin. Mabel moved to the window, watching the rain, sheet down. "Mr. Boone," she said after a while, "would you mind if I cleaned up the spare room? I noticed it needs some attention." Jack paused in his cooking. "The spare room?" "No, Mrs. Mabel. You'll take the bedroom proper. I won't have my wife sleeping in the storage room." She turned to face him, her chin lifting slightly. "You needn't make a fuss, Mr. Boone. We both know this isn't a real marriage. The spare room will suit me fine." But a loud crack of thunder interrupted him, and suddenly water began dripping from a spot in the ceiling, right into Jack's coffee cup on the table. They both stared at the unexpected intrusion, and then, to Jack's surprise, Mabel laughed. It was a warm, genuine sound that transformed her face. "Well," she said, eyes twinkling, "I reckon that's one way to water down your coffee?" Jack found himself chuckling, too, the tension in the room easing. "Been meaning to fix that leak," he admitted. "Just haven't gotten around to it." "We can add it to tomorrow's tasks," Mabel said practically, moving to empty the coffee cup before more rain could fall in it. The word "we" hung in the air between them, a reminder of their new shared life. They ate supper at the table, the rain providing gentle accompaniment to their quiet meal. Jack had to admit the beans tasted better than usual, something about having company to share them with, perhaps. Mabel ate carefully, taking small bites, but cleaned her plate. "Thank you," she said when finished. "It was good." "Just beans," Jack replied, but felt pleased all the same. After the dishes were done, Mabel insisted on at least looking at the spare room. Jack showed her the small space, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. "It needs work," he said, hoping to discourage her, but Mabel was already making plans. "Some sweeping, a good scrubbing, move these boxes to the barn." She looked up at him. "If you don't mind?" Jack recognized determination when he saw it. "It's yours to do with as you please," he conceded. "But the offer of the bedroom stands." "The spare room will do fine," she repeated firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." Jack retreated to his bedroom, listening to the rain and thinking about how different everything felt with another person in the house. He hadn't realized how accustomed he'd grown to silence until it was broken. Morning came with clearing skies and the sound of movement on the roof. Jack stepped outside to find Mabel already at work, carefully applying pitch to the leak they'd discovered the night before. She'd found his repair supplies in the barn and was handling the job like she'd done it 100 times before. "You shouldn't have to do that," he called up to her. "Nonsense," she replied, not pausing in her work. "It needs doing, and I know how. My father taught me about repairs when I was young." She positioned a small piece of tin over the patch of pitch. "There, that should hold it." Jack watched her make her way carefully down the ladder, noting how capable she seemed, how matter-of-fact about the task. No complaints about it being men's work, no fuss about dirtying her hands. Just something that needed doing. So she did it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had exactly planned, but both seemed to accept. Mabel rose early, often before Jack, to start breakfast and tend to the morning chores. She worked steadily on the spare room in between other tasks, transforming it bit by bit into a proper bedroom. Jack found himself looking forward to their shared meals, to the quiet companionship of evening chores. After supper each night, Mabel would read from her worn Bible by lamplight. Sometimes she read aloud, her voice soft but clear in the gathering darkness. Jack often found himself listening, though he pretended to be busy with other things. The familiar words seemed different somehow, coming from her lips. Small kindnesses began to accumulate between them, like drops of water slowly filling a bucket. Mabel mended Jack's shirts without being asked, somehow making the worn fabric look almost new again. Jack brought her wild strawberries he found while checking the fence line, remembering how she'd mentioned liking them. She learned how he took his coffee. He noticed she preferred her bread with a touch of honey. The spare room gradually took shape under Mabel's careful attention. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, hung simple curtains made from the calico they'd bought, arranged the furniture to make the small space feel larger. Jack found himself helping without really meaning to, moving the heavier pieces, building her a small shelf for her few books. "You don't have to work so hard," he told her one evening, watching her patch a worn quilt she'd found in one of the boxes. "You're not a servant here." Mabel looked up from her stitching. "I know that, Mr. Boone. But I believe in earning my keep, marriage of convenience or not." "You could call me Jack," he said suddenly, surprising himself. "Seeing as we're married and all?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I'll try," she said softly, returning to her sewing. Thunder rumbled again that night, but no rain leaked through the roof. Jack lay awake, listening to the storm and thinking about how different his home felt now. The walls seemed warmer somehow, the rooms more lived in. Even Mary's photograph on his dresser looked different, less like an accusation and more like a gentle memory. He thought about Mabel in her small room, about her quiet determination and unexpected laughter, about how she'd taken this strange situation and somehow made it feel almost natural. Each small kindness between them was like a brick being carefully removed from the wall he'd built around his heart after Mary died. The thunder faded into the distance, and Jack finally drifted off to sleep, wondering what the next day would bring. Before Mabel came, he'd stopped expecting anything but loneliness. Now he found himself looking forward to mornings, to shared meals, to the simple comfort of another person's presence in his home. Through it all, they maintained their careful distance, she in her spare room, he in his bedroom, both playing their parts in this marriage that wasn't quite a marriage. But something was changing, as subtle and unstoppable as the changing of seasons. Each day, each small kindness, each shared moment chipped away at the walls between them, though neither was quite ready to admit it. The ranch felt different, too. Flowers appeared in tin cans on the porch. The chicken coop got a fresh coat of whitewash. Even the old cow seemed to give more milk, though Jack told himself that was just his imagination. But there was no denying that his home was transforming, becoming something new and unexpected, all because of a moment of mercy at a livestock auction. After the evening scripture reading, They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Jack studied his coffee cup, thinking about that first raindrop that had splashed into it, and how Mabel's laughter had somehow made his home feel more like home than it had in years. The early spring morning dawned crisp and clear, with dew sparkling on the new grass. Jack had risen before sunrise to check on the cattle, mounting his favorite mare, Starlight. The horse's coat gleamed in the growing light, her steady gait carrying him along the fence line where new calves grazed beside their mothers. Near the creek crossing, a sudden sharp whinny pierced the air. Starlight reared, catching Jack off guard. He managed to stay mounted, but immediately felt the mare favoring her right foreleg. His heart sank as he spotted the culprit, a loose strand of barbed wire, partially hidden in the tall grass, now stained with blood. "Easy, girl, easy now," he murmured, dismounting quickly to examine the damage. The wire had sliced deep into Starlight's leg, just above the hock. Blood flowed freely from the wound, and the mare trembled with pain. Jack's hands shook as he gentled her, knowing what such injuries usually meant for horses on the frontier. He led Starlight slowly back to the barn, his throat tight. The mare had been with him through everything, the war, building the ranch, even Mary's passing. She'd never failed him, and now he'd failed to protect her from this. Each limping step felt like an accusation. Mabel was already in the yard when they approached, hanging fresh washing on the line. She took one look at the situation and dropped her laundry basket, hurrying over with concern etched on her face. "Oh, the poor dear," she said, reaching for Starlight's bridle. The mare, usually skittish with strangers, allowed Mabel's touch. "What happened?" "Barbed wire," Jack said grimly, leading the horse into the barn. "Cut's too deep. You might want to go inside, Mabel. What needs doing ain't pleasant." Mabel's eyes widened as she realized his intention. "You mean to put her down, without even trying to save her?" "Seen it before," Jack replied, his voice heavy. "Leg wounds like this, they fester. Better to end it clean than let her suffer." "No." Mabel's voice was firm, surprising them both. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me about herbs and poultices. If you'll let me try—" Jack hesitated. He'd seen too many horses lost to infection to hold much hope, but something in Mabel's determined expression made him pause. "What would you need?" "First, clean water and rags. Then I'll need to gather some herbs. Yarrow grows wild here, and I saw some golden seal in the meadow yesterday. We'll need honey too and clean bandages." Against his better judgment, Jack found himself nodding. "All right. But if she starts showing signs of fever—" "Then we'll do what needs doing," Mabel agreed softly. "But let's give her a chance first." They worked together to clean the wound, Mabel's gentle hands never faltering despite the mare's occasional flinching. She talked soothingly to Starlight the whole time, mixing her remedies with quiet confidence. Jack watched, holding the horse steady as she applied a strange-smelling paste to the gash. "Yarrow stops the bleeding," she explained as she worked. "Golden seal fights the corruption. Honey helps it heal clean." Her movements were sure and practiced, wrapping the leg with careful precision. "We'll need to change it twice a day. Keep it clean." Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd seen field doctors with less steady hands than this woman who'd come to his home as a mail-order bride barely 2 weeks ago. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Every morning and evening, Mabel would clean and rebind Starlight's wound, mixing fresh poultices and checking for signs of infection. Jack helped hold the horse, watching in growing amazement as the angry red flesh began to heal clean and pink. Between treatments, Mabel went about her usual tasks: cooking, cleaning, tending the kitchen garden she'd started. But now Jack found himself seeing her differently. He noticed how she hummed hymns while she worked, how she always seemed to know just where to touch Starlight to keep her calm, how her hands remained gentle even when tired. On the fourth day, Jack caught her gathering more herbs at dawn, her skirts damp with dew. She looked up as he approached, a basket of green plants in her arms. "My grandmother used to say that herbs are God's mercy made manifest," she said, answering his unspoken question. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Jack replied, taking the heavy basket from her. She was. A shadow crossed Mabel's face. "She died during the fever outbreak, tending to others until the end. She taught me everything she could first, though. Said knowledge was a gift meant to be used in service." Jack thought about that as they walked back to the barn together. He'd been so quick to judge, to assume death was the only answer. But Mabel had seen another way, had insisted on trying, had worked tirelessly to save an animal she barely knew, all because she believed in mercy. A week after the accident, Starlight was walking without a limp. The wound had closed clean, leaving only a pale scar where the wire had cut. Jack watched the mare trot across the paddock, still hardly believing what he was seeing. That evening, after supper was cleared away and the lamp lit, Jack finally found the words he'd been struggling with all week. "Thank you," he said simply, meeting Mabel's eyes across the table. "What you did for Starlight? I'm grateful." Mabel ducked her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Mercy always finds a way," she replied softly. "Sometimes we just have to be patient enough to let it work." Jack studied her in the lamplight. This woman who had come to his home as a stranger, who had worked without complaint, who had shown such unexpected wisdom and skill. The walls he'd built around his heart since Mary's death felt a little less solid than before. Outside, the first cottonwood buds were breaking open, releasing their cotton-soft seeds to drift on the spring breeze. New life was stirring everywhere, in the pastures where calves played, in the garden where Mabel's plantings were beginning to sprout, and perhaps, Jack realized with a start, in his own heart as well. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the prairie. Mabel picked up her mending, the lamplight catching the gleam of her needle as she worked. Jack watched her hands move, remembering how surely they had tended to Starlight's wound, how they never seemed to be idle. The mare's soft nickering drifted in from the barn, healthy and strong, living proof of what care and patience could accomplish. Jack found himself wondering what other healing might be possible, given time and trust enough to let it happen. From the window came the sweet scent of spring, carrying promise on the evening breeze. The cottonwoods whispered their ancient songs, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Jack felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a winter-locked river. Not a complete thaw yet, but the beginning of one. Mabel glanced up from her sewing, caught him watching her, and smiled. A quick, shy thing that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. But it left a warmth in its wake, like sunshine breaking through clouds after a long storm. "More coffee?" she asked, already rising to fetch the pot. "Much obliged," Jack replied, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the coffee. He watched her move around the kitchen, efficient and sure, and thought about how his home had changed since she arrived. How he had changed, though he was only beginning to realize it. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, Starlight moved in her stall, healthy and whole thanks to Mabel's knowledge and care. The mare's recovery seemed to mirror something larger happening on the ranch. A gradual healing, a return to life, a reminder that second chances sometimes came in unexpected forms. Jack sipped his coffee, letting its warmth spread through him, matching the unfamiliar but not unwelcome warmth in his heart. Some things, he was learning, required more than just strength or determination. Sometimes they needed gentle hands, patient hearts, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to heal. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket, filled with the small sounds of home. Mabel's needle pulling thread through fabric, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Each sound a reminder that life went on, that change came whether invited or not, that healing happened in its own time and way. Through the window, the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. The cottonwoods stood like sentinels against the horizon, their new buds promising summer shade to come. Everything spoke of renewal, of second chances, of hope taking root in unexpected places. The spring morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for wash day. Mabel gathered the week's laundry into her worn willow basket, tucking a small loaf of fresh bread beneath the clothes for her midday meal. The weight of wet clothes would make the walk back difficult, but the river's sweet water was worth the effort. Jack had offered to haul water to the house, but Mabel preferred washing at the river itself. Something about the flowing water and open sky helped ease the loneliness that still crept into her heart sometimes, despite the growing comfort of her new life at the ranch. "I won't be gone more than a few hours," she told Jack as he saddled his horse for the morning fence check. He nodded, adjusting his hat against the sun. "Mind you stay within sight of the crossing," he said. "Some folks get nervous about Indians coming down from the reservation to gather herbs this time of year." Mabel adjusted her basket. "The good Lord made this land for all his children, Mr. Boone." She spoke softly but firmly. "I reckon he meant for its medicines to be shared." Jack didn't argue, just mounted his horse with a thoughtful expression. Mabel watched him ride out, then started down the well-worn path to the river, her boots crunching on the sandy soil. The morning air carried the scent of sage and last night's rain. At the river's edge, Mabel found her usual spot, a smooth rock perfect for scrubbing. She settled her basket and knelt to begin her work, the cool water refreshing against her hands. The rhythmic sound of cloth against washboard mixed with birdsong and the river's gentle murmur. She was halfway through the wash when movement caught her eye. A young native girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, was working her way along the opposite bank, carefully stripping bark from the red willows that grew there. The girl wore a cotton dress, clearly from the reservation agency, but moved with the sure grace of someone who knew the land well. Their eyes met across the water. The girl hesitated, clearly unsure of her welcome. Mabel smiled and raised her hand in greeting. "Good morning," she called softly. "The willows are beautiful this spring." The girl straightened, clutching her bundle of bark. "You are not afraid?" she asked in careful English. "Should I be?" Mabel reached for her bread loaf. "Would you like to share my lunch? It's still warm from the oven." After a moment's consideration, the girl crossed at the shallow part of the river, her bare feet finding secure holds on the slippery stones. Up close, Mabel could see the intelligence in her dark eyes and the slight wariness in her posture. "I am called Wapita," the girl said, settling on a nearby rock. "My mother works at the agency, teaching weaving to the women." Mabel tore the bread in half, offering the larger portion. "I'm Mabel Boone. This is my husband's ranch you crossed through." She gestured at the fresh willow bark. "Are you gathering medicine?" Wapita nodded, accepting the bread. "For fever tea. The old ways are still good ways, even if the agency doctor disagrees." She took a bite, eyes widening. "This is good bread." "Thank you. My mother taught me to bake, just as your mother teaches weaving." Mabel returned to her washing, giving the girl space to relax. "Would you teach me the word for river in your language?" Thus began an exchange that filled the morning with learning. Wapita shared words in Ute, river, willow, sky, friend, while Mabel listened carefully, trying to wrap her tongue around the unfamiliar sounds. In return, she taught Wapita the names of the herbs growing along the bank in English. As they talked, Mabel noticed how Wapita's initial reserve melted away. The girl spoke of her mother's work at the agency, of gathering traditional medicines with her grandmother, of trying to keep old ways alive while learning new ones. Her voice grew animated when she described a healing prayer her people used. "Would you teach it to me?" Mabel asked. "I'd be honored to learn." Wapita's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with pleasure. She began to sing softly, showing Mabel the gestures that accompanied the prayer. Together they practiced until Mabel could follow along, her voice joining Wapita's in the ancient words of healing. When they finished, Mabel felt moved to share something in return. "There's a song we sing in our church," she said. "It's about amazing grace, about how love can find us even when we're lost." She began to sing "Amazing Grace," her clear voice carrying over the river's music. Wapita listened intently, then asked to learn it. Soon their voices twined together, English words and Ute prayer creating something new and beautiful in the morning air. Birds paused in their songs to listen, and even the river seemed to quiet its rush. The sun climbed higher, reminding Mabel of the time. She had to finish the washing, and Wapita needed to deliver her willow bark. But as they prepared to part, both felt the solid foundation of friendship that had been laid. "Come again next wash day," Mabel offered. "I'll bring more bread." Wapita smiled, the first full smile Mabel had seen. "I will teach you more songs," she promised. "Songs my grandmother says keep the heart strong." They parted with waves across the river, each carrying something precious from their meeting. More than just bread and willow bark, but the gift of understanding between two worlds. When Mabel returned home, her basket heavy with clean, wet clothes, she found Jack already back from his fence work. He helped her hang the washing, then asked carefully about her morning. "I saw smoke from a fire down by the river," he said. "Any trouble?" "No trouble," Mabel replied, pinning a shirt to the line. "I met a lovely girl named Wapita. Her mother works at the agency. We shared bread and songs." Jack's face creased with concern. "Folks in town might talk. They don't much like mixing with the reservation Indians." Mabel continued hanging clothes, but her voice was firm. "Kindness doesn't need permission, Mr. Boone. The good book tells us to love our neighbors. It doesn't say only the ones who look like us." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Mabel began humming the healing prayer Wapita had taught her. Jack looked up from his paper, listening. "What's that tune?" he asked. "Don't reckon I've heard it before." "It's a Ute prayer for healing," Mabel explained. "Would you like to learn it?" When he didn't immediately object, she began teaching him the words, explaining their meaning as best she could remember. To her surprise and joy, Jack's deep voice joined hers, stumbling at first over the unfamiliar words but growing more confident. The prayer filled their cabin with its gentle power, and Mabel saw something soften in Jack's face as they sang. They practiced together until the lamp began to dim, needing more oil. As Mabel rose to tend it, she heard Jack continuing to hum the prayer under his breath, almost unconsciously. The sound wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild music mixing with the remembered sounds of two cultures' songs by the river. Mabel smiled as she trimmed the lamp wick, thinking of Wapita's promise to teach her more songs. Perhaps music could build bridges where words alone failed. The lamp's gentle light filled the cabin once more, illuminating Jack still humming the prayer as he read his paper. Mabel returned to her mending, her needle moving in time with the ancient melody. In that moment, she felt the first real stirring of hope, not just for herself and Jack, but for the possibility of understanding between all God's children in this wild, beautiful land. As she sewed, she silently thanked the Lord for leading her to this place, where rivers sang their endless songs and people could learn to sing together, despite their differences. The evening settled around them like a blessing, warm and full of promise. Through the window, the first stars appeared, the same stars that had guided people across these lands for countless generations. Mabel thought of Wapita's grandmother, teaching her granddaughter the old ways, and of her own grandmother teaching her to bake bread. Some things, she realized, spoke a language all their own: kindness, music, the sharing of food and knowledge. These were the threads that could weave people together, if only they were brave enough to try. The idea came to Mabel one morning as she watched the railroad workers trudging past their property. The men looked tired, their shoulders slumped under the weight of picks and shovels. Most were immigrants, Irish, Chinese, and Italian, working long hours for meager pay. Their weathered faces reminded her of her father's after a hard day at his forge. "Those men could use some proper bread," she murmured, pulling her latest batch from the oven. The golden brown loaves filled the kitchen with their homey aroma. Jack looked up from his coffee. "Railroad men? They get their meals from the company cook?" "Hardtack and salt pork, most likely." Mabel's nose wrinkled. "Not fit for dogs, let alone Christian men working in God's sunshine." The next morning, she rose before dawn to bake extra loaves. While the dough rose, she carefully copied Bible verses onto small strips of paper. Some spoke of comfort, others of strength and hope. Each one she selected with thought for men far from home. When the loaves cooled, she wrapped them carefully in clean cloth, tucking a verse inside each one. Jack watched from the porch as she loaded her basket. "You mean to walk all that way?" he asked, concerned. "It's not so far to the depot fence," she replied, "and the morning's cool yet." The railroad depot sat at the edge of town, where new track stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Mabel arrived just as the work crews gathered for their morning assignments. She placed the wrapped loaves along the fence, then hurried away before anyone noticed. That evening, Jack returned from town with news. "Heard talk at the feed store," he said over supper. "Railroad men finding fresh bread by the depot. They're calling it angel's bread." Mabel blushed, focusing on her plate. Did they like it?" "Foreman says it's the best bread he's tasted since leaving Boston." Jack's voice held a note of pride he couldn't quite hide. "Though some are puzzled by the papers inside." "God's word feeds the spirit," Mabel said softly, "while bread feeds the body." The next week she baked more loaves, adding dried fruit and nuts when she could spare them. Each morning she made her quiet pilgrimage to the depot fence. Soon, the workers began watching, for her, touching their caps respectfully when she passed. Some left small gifts in return: wildflowers, pretty stones, even a carved wooden cross from one of the Italian carpenters. Word spread through town. The saloon keeper, Mr. O'Malley, sent his boy running to the ranch one afternoon. "Pa says to tell Mrs. Boone her pies sell better than his whiskey biscuits," the lad announced proudly. "He'll pay fair price for any she's willing to bake." Jack frowned at this development. "You don't need to be baking for the saloon," he protested that evening. "Folks will talk." "They already do," Mabel replied calmly, kneading dough for the next day's bread. Better they talk about pies than worse things. As summer deepened, Mabel's reputation grew. Railroad workers spoke of her kindness in the bunkhouse. Townswomen whispered about her at the general store. Even the Chinese laborers, who kept mostly to themselves, would smile and bow when she passed. Jack noticed the change in how people treated them. Where once there had been mockery, now there was respect. The same men who had laughed at the auction now touched their hats to Mabel. Their wives, who had previously turned away, now stopped to chat. One Saturday, Jack found Mabel teaching Mrs. O'Malley's daughter to make pie crust. "The secret's in how gentle you are with it," she was saying, "like handling a baby bird." "You're becoming quite the town celebrity," he commented later, trying to keep his tone light. Mabel looked up from her Bible. "Does that trouble you?" Before he could answer, hoofbeats announced visitors. It was the circuit preacher's wife, coming to ask if Mabel would teach the Sunday school children her hymns. "The little ones love your singing," Mrs. Peterson explained, "and some of the railroad families have asked about attending service." That Sunday, the church pews filled as they never had before. Railroad workers sat beside ranchers, their wives and children cleaned up in their best clothes. In the back, several Chinese laborers stood quietly, drawn by curiosity and Mabel's kind reputation. When the congregation sang Amazing Grace, Mabel's clear voice lifted above the others, drawing everyone into harmony. Jack watched his wife from their usual pew, seeing her as others did, a woman whose simple faith and kindness transformed everything she touched. After the service, several townspeople approached Jack. "You've got yourself a good woman there, Boone," old Mr. Henderson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "A real blessing to the community." Jack felt his face grow warm. He'd never been comfortable with praise, but this was different. This wasn't about him at all. The ride home was quiet, filled with the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Finally, Mabel spoke. "Does it bother you?" she asked softly. "All the talk about your wife's baking and teaching?" Jack considered his words carefully. "No, ma'am," he said at last. "I reckon heaven minds worse things than kindness spreading through a town." Mabel smiled, understanding all he left unsaid. They rode on in comfortable silence as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors as warm as fresh-baked bread. The next morning she rose, as always, before dawn. As she mixed her dough and copied out her verses, she hummed the hymns that had filled the church. Outside, the first birds began their own songs, welcoming another day of possibility and grace. Jack watched her from the doorway, remembering the trembling woman from the auction. That scared, humiliated soul had bloomed like a desert flower after rain, touching lives with quiet strength. His chest tightened with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. When she loaded her basket with fresh loaves, he stepped forward. "Let me drive you to the depot," he offered. "Save your feet for baking." Mabel's smile was worth more than gold. Together they rode into town, where railroad workers already waited by the fence. They touched their caps to Jack as he helped Mabel down from the wagon. "God bless you, Mrs. Boone," called one old-timer. "Your bread reminds me of my mother's back in County Cork." "The verses help us remember home," added another, "even when home's across the sea." Jack watched his wife distribute her loaves, saw how naturally she spoke with everyone, rich or poor, foreign or local. Her example had begun to change hearts, softening old prejudices like water wearing away stone. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, the kindness in her face. Jack felt that strange tightness in his chest again. This time, he was beginning to understand its meaning. On the wagon seat beside him, Mabel hummed her hymn, and Jack found himself humming along. The town was changing, and so was he, one loaf of bread and one verse at a time. The late summer days had settled into a gentle rhythm at the Boone Ranch. Each morning brought the same peaceful routine. Mabel rising before dawn to bake, Jack tending the cattle, shared meals punctuated by comfortable silence and occasional soft conversation. Even the land seemed to breathe easier, the garden flourishing under Mabel's care, the livestock fat and content in their pastures. On this particular morning, Jack stood at the corral, mending a broken rail while Mabel hung laundry on the line. The breeze carried the scent of her fresh bread and the sound of her quiet humming. He found himself pausing in his work, watching the way she moved between the sheets, pinning them with practiced efficiency. "Looks like rain coming," she called, glancing at the gathering clouds in the west. Jack nodded, squinting at the horizon. "Reckon we could use it. Might head into town before it hits, pick up those supplies we've been needing." Mabel folded the empty basket against her hip. "I'll pack you some bread for the journey." The ride into San Luis Crossing took just under 2 hours. Jack's horse picked its way along the familiar trail while he thought about the list of items they needed: nails, coffee, sugar, and that bolt of calico Mabel had mentioned wanting for new curtains. He hadn't told her, but he'd been saving extra money just for that purpose. The town had changed in recent months. Where once there had been suspicious glances and whispered mockery, now people greeted him warmly. "Morning, Mr. Boone," called Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile porch. "Tell your wife her remedy for Quincy worked wonders on my Tommy." Jack touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. Even now, months later, it still surprised him how Mabel had won over the townspeople with her quiet ways and generous heart. He tied his horse outside the general store and started gathering supplies. He was just settling his account when young Billy, the telegraph operator's son, burst through the door. "Mr. Boone! Pa says there's an urgent wire for Mrs. Boone." Jack frowned. In all these months, Mabel had never received a telegram. "From where?" "Topeka, sir. The railroad agent brought it special." Something cold settled in Jack's stomach at the mention of the railroad agent. That man had never brought anything but trouble. Still, he followed Billy to the telegraph office. Inside, the railroad agent, Mr. Peterson, stood smugly by the operator's desk, holding a yellow paper between his fingers. His smile reminded Jack of a coyote spotting an injured rabbit. "Ah, Mr. Boone," Peterson drawled. "How fortunate. I was just about to ride out to your ranch with this most interesting message." Jack reached for the telegram, but Peterson held it just out of reach. "Quite a surprising development," he continued. "Almost as surprising as finding out your wife already has a husband." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He snatched the telegram from Peterson's hand, his eyes scanning the brief message. "Ruth husband alive, invalid, requests contact, stop residing Topeka Mercy Hospital, stop urgent response requested, stop." Jack read it 3 times, each word burning deeper into his mind. Ruth, husband, alive. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "I took the liberty of checking the records," Peterson said, clearly enjoying himself. "Seems your Mrs. Boone was previously Mrs. Henry Ruth of Topeka. No record of his death or any divorce. Fascinating, isn't it?" Jack folded the telegram carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the trembling in his hands. "Much obliged for delivering the message," he said stiffly, turning to leave. "Oh, and Boone," Peterson called after him, "might want to review that land claim of yours. Marriage has to be legal for homesteading rights to stand." The ride home seemed to take forever. Dark clouds had gathered overhead, matching Jack's mood. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he approached the ranch, and he could see Mabel hurrying to get the laundry off the line before the storm hit. She looked up at the sound of his horse, her smile fading as she saw his expression. "Jack, what's wrong?" He dismounted slowly, holding out the telegram without a word. She took it, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers. He watched her face drain of color as she read. "Oh, dear God," she whispered, pressing one hand to her mouth. "Henry?" Lightning flickered across the sky, followed by a low growl of thunder. Fat raindrops began to fall, spotting the telegram's paper. "Come inside," Jack said roughly. "Storm's about to break." They barely made it to the porch before the heavens opened. Rain drummed on the roof as they stood in silence, the telegram lying between them like a snake in the grass. Finally, Mabel spoke, her voice small and broken. "I need to explain." Jack moved to the door, holding it open. Once inside, he built up the fire mechanically, needing something to do with his hands. Mabel sank into her usual chair, twisting her apron between her fingers. "Henry Ruth was a miner," she began softly. "We married when I was 18. 5 years ago, there was a flash flood at the mine. They found pieces of his lunch pail, his boots. The other miners said there was no way anyone could have survived. I mourned him proper. Waited 3 years before even thinking of coming west." Jack stared into the flames, remembering the auction, the way she'd trembled when he bid that silver dollar. Had she been afraid then, or guilty? "I never meant deceit," Mabel continued, her voice breaking. "I truly believed Henry was dead. I would never have—" The fire popped and hissed, throwing shadows on the wall. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, a deeper storm was brewing. Jack's mind raced with implications. If Mabel was still legally married to Henry Ruth, then their own marriage was void. Without a legal marriage, the land claim could be invalidated. Everything he'd built, everything they'd created together, could be lost. He heard movement behind him and turned to see Mabel rising from her chair. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. "It's only right." Jack wanted to stop her, to say something. Anything. But words failed him. He watched as she climbed the stairs to the spare room she'd insisted on using all these months. Even now she'd kept her distance, as if some part of her had known this day might come. The storm had settled into a steady rain by the time she came back down, carrying her small carpet bag. It was the same one she'd arrived with, he realized. She'd accumulated so little in her time here, as if she'd never quite believed she could stay. She paused by the fire, her face lined with sorrow and resignation. "I never meant deceit," she repeated softly. "These months here, they've been more than I deserved." Jack remained silent, his throat too tight for speech. He watched as she set a folded paper on the table, the recipe for her healing poultice, he realized. Even now, thinking of others. "The bread in the kitchen will keep for a few days," she said, her practical nature asserting itself even in grief. "And there's stew in the pot for your supper." Still, Jack couldn't speak. His mind was full of memories. Mabel singing hymns while she worked, teaching that Ute girl to bake, the way she'd nursed his favorite mare back to health. The quiet strength that had transformed not just his ranch, but the entire community. She moved to the door, then hesitated, turning back one last time. "I'm sorry, Jack. Truly sorry." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the cabin. Through the window, Jack watched her small figure disappear into the rain, heading toward town. The same road they'd traveled together that first night, now taking her away. He sank into his chair by the fire, feeling older than his years. The flames blurred before his eyes as he stared into them, seeing memories dance in the coals. Mabel mending his shirts, Mabel praying by his late wife's grave, Mabel's smile when the mare had finally healed. Outside, The rain continued to fall, washing away tracks, erasing signs of passage. Inside, Jack Boone sat motionless, while the fire slowly died to embers, and night crept into the cabin's empty corners. The telegram lay on the table where Mabel had dropped it, its words stark and black against the yellow paper, rewriting the story they'd begun to believe in. In the growing darkness, even the crickets seemed to have fallen silent, as if they too mourned what had been lost. The pre-dawn air bit cold against Mabel's cheeks as she moved silently through the cabin. Her fingers trembled as she folded the small piece of paper, carefully tucking it into the pocket of Jack's weathered coat where he'd be sure to find it. 3 simple words from Scripture. Love beareth all things. She'd spent the night in the barn, unable to sleep, praying for guidance. The old mule, Benjamin, watched her with gentle eyes as she secured her carpetbag to his saddle. She'd chosen him over a horse. Benjamin was steady, reliable, and unlikely to be missed right away. Just like her, he was often overlooked but faithful in his service. "Easy now," she whispered, patting his neck as she led him from the barn. The eastern sky showed just a hint of gray, though stars still glimmered overhead. A chill wind whipped at her skirts, carrying the sharp scent of coming snow. Inside the cabin, Jack's soft snores drifted down from the loft. Mabel paused, her heart aching to memorize the sound. How many mornings had she listened to his quiet breathing while she kindled the morning fire? How many shared meals and gentle words would now remain only memories? Benjamin's hooves made barely a sound on the soft earth as they started down the trail. Mabel didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the cabin grow small behind her, to watch smoke rise from the chimney when Jack woke to find her gone. The mission in town would shelter her until word came from Kansas, until she knew what remained of her past life with Henry. The sun was just touching the hills when Jack stirred from sleep. The cabin felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still. No coffee smell, no quiet humming, no creak of floorboards beneath Mabel's careful steps. His heart knew before his mind did, recognized the emptiness like a physical pain. He found the note when he reached for his coat. The paper was soft, as if she'd held it long before writing those words. Love beareth all things. His fingers crushed the paper, then carefully smoothed it out again. The barn door stood open, morning light showing Benjamin's empty stall. Jack saddled his horse with quick, efficient movements, trying not to think of Mabel alone on the trail. The morning was bitter cold, threatening snow. She'd taken nothing but that small carpet bag, no proper provisions for winter travel. Hoofprints led down the main trail, clear in the morning dew. Jack urged his horse forward, scanning the path ahead. But the hills were empty, only scrub brush and scattered pines breaking the landscape. No sign of a lone woman on a mule. The trail split at Coyote Ridge. Jack reined in, studying the ground. The recent rain had softened the earth, but the tracks were already fading. Which way would she go? The direct route to town, or the longer path past the mission? His horse pawed the ground, sensing his indecision. Dark clouds were gathering overhead as Jack searched the hillsides. The wind carried a bitter edge now, and the first few flakes of sleet stung his face. He'd have to choose soon. The weather was turning, and following the wrong trail could leave Mabel alone in the storm. At the mission, Reverend Thompson's wife, Sarah, opened the door to find Mabel shivering on the step. "Good heavens, child! Come in at once!" She pulled Mabel inside, calling for hot tea and blankets. "I'm sorry to impose," Mabel began, but Sarah waved away her words. "Nonsense! I heard about the telegram." Sarah's kind face showed only concern. no judgment. You'll stay here until matters are sorted. It's what the good Lord would have us do. The mission's small guest room was spare but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the chapel yard. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed, her carpet bag still clutched in her lap, as Sarah brought tea and fresh biscuits. "You're not the first to need shelter here," Sarah said gently, "and you won't be the last. Rest now. We'll send word to the telegraph office when the weather clears." Outside, the sleet was falling harder. Through the window, Mabel watched ice coating the telegraph lines, making them sag between poles. The wires hummed in the wind, a lonely sound that seemed to echo her heart's confusion. Jack had reached town by now, his horse's hooves slipping on the icy streets. The telegraph office was dark. Peterson had closed early due to the weather. Through the window, Jack could see the operator's desk empty, the machine silent under its dust cover. He tied his horse in the shelter of the livery stable and made his way to the mission. The sleet had turned to driving snow, whitening the world in minutes. His boots left dark prints on the chapel steps as he knocked at the door. Sarah Thompson answered, her face compassionate but firm. "She's here, Jack. She's safe." "I need to speak with her," he said, his voice rough with cold and emotion. "Not tonight." Sarah's tone was gentle but allowed no argument. "She needs time to pray, to seek guidance, and you need time to search your own heart." "The weather," Jack began. "We'll care for her," Sarah assured him. "Go home, Jack. When the lines are repaired, when we know the truth about Henry Ruth, then there will be time for words." Jack stood for a long moment, snow gathering on his shoulders. Finally, he nodded. "Tell her." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Tell her the mare's leg is fully healed, thanks to her poultice." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. "I'll tell her." The snow was falling heavily now, erasing tracks, muffling sounds. In her small room, Mabel heard boots on the chapel steps, then voices too low to make out. She pressed her hand to the cold window glass, watching a dark figure move away through the swirling white. The telegraph lines groaned under their coating of ice. One by one, they began to snap, the sharp crack like gunshots in the winter air. Each broken wire was another delay, another day of uncertainty, another night of separate prayers in the darkness. In the mission's kitchen, Sarah Thompson stirred the fire and set water to boil for more tea. She had seen many storms, both of weather and of heart, in her years at the mission. She knew that some breaks needed time to mend. Some wounds required patience more than medicine. Jack's horse picked its way carefully through deepening snow. The cabin would be cold and dark when he returned. No lamp in the window, no warm welcome waiting. But Mabel's note burned in his pocket like a coal. 3 words that offered no answers but held all hope. "Love beareth all things." The storm settled in for days, transforming the landscape into a world of white and silence. In her room at the mission, Mabel kept to her habits, rising before dawn, helping in the kitchen, teaching the mission children their letters. She tried not to think of Jack alone in the cabin, tried not to imagine him finding her note, tried not to remember the sound of his breathing in the quiet morning hours. Each day, Sarah Thompson walked to the telegraph office to check for news from Kansas. Each day she returned, shaking her head. The lines were still down, the weather still fierce, the answers still waiting in some distant office in Topeka. The days stretched into a week. The snow continued to fall, then turned to sleet, then snow again. The mission's stores began to run low. The children grew restless, confined indoors by the bitter weather. Mabel taught them hymns and Bible verses, told them stories of her grandmother's herb lore, showed them how to make simple remedies from the mission's kitchen stores. At night, She lay awake listening to the wind, remembering other storms weathered in Jack's cabin. The leak in the roof that had made them laugh, the sound of him humming Ute prayers as he mended tack by the fire, the quiet comfort of shared silences. In the cabin, Jack kept to his own rhythms, feeding stock, checking fences, ensuring survival through the long storm. But everything felt hollow, mechanical, as if the heart had gone out of the work. He found himself turning to speak to someone who wasn't there, reaching for a coffee cup that wasn't filled, listening for footsteps that didn't come. The broken telegraph lines swayed in the wind, useless as empty promises. Somewhere in Kansas, a man named Henry Ruth waited for an answer. Somewhere in town, Mabel waited for truth. And in a snowbound cabin, Jack Boone waited for spring, for clear skies, for words that might bridge the distance between hearts. Sarah Thompson watched it all with wise eyes and a patient heart. She saw Mabel's quiet strength, the way she turned her pain to service, teaching and helping despite her own uncertainty. She saw Jack's daily rides past the mission, checking from a distance that the lamp still burned in Mabel's window. "Love beareth all things," the note had said. But bearing was not the same as understanding, and love sometimes required the courage to wait in silence, to trust beyond knowledge, to hope beyond sight. The sleet continued to fall, each frozen drop a small prayer, each moment of separation a test of faith. The mission bell rang for evening prayers, its sound muffled by snow but carrying still, a reminder that some things endured beyond storm and doubt, beyond broken wires and waiting hearts. In her room, Mabel lit her small lamp and opened her Bible, seeking comfort in familiar words. Outside, snow erased the day's tracks, covering all signs of passage, leaving only white pages waiting to be written anew when the storm finally passed. The blizzard descended like a white curtain, turning day to twilight. Wind howled through the town's empty streets, piling snowdrifts against shuttered windows. Inside the mission, Sarah Thompson urged everyone to stay indoors, but Jack Boone couldn't rest. His thoughts kept returning to Mabel, alone in her small room. The temperature dropped further as evening approached. Ignoring the preacher's warnings about certain death in such weather, Jack saddled his most sure-footed horse. "Lord, help me find her," he whispered, spurring into the storm. Near the frozen creek, his horse snorted and balked. Through the swirling snow, Jack spotted irregular tracks, wagon wheels cutting toward the reservation. His heart clenched. He knew Mabel's giving nature, her concern for others above herself. The cold bit through his clothes as he followed the trail. His fingers grew numb on the reins, his face burning with frost. Then, through the white veil, he saw her, a dark shape crumpled in the snow near Wapita's family cabin. Beside her lay a cloth sack spilling cornmeal and dried herbs. "Mabel!" His voice broke as he dismounted. She was breathing, but barely. Jack gathered her into his arms, her body cold as ice. "Don't leave me," he prayed, holding her close as the storm raged around them. "Lord, give her strength." Jack carried Mabel into the warmth of the cabin, his heart pounding. He laid her gently on the bed near the pot-bellied stove, piling every quilt and blanket he owned around her shivering form. For 2 endless days, he kept the fire blazing, barely sleeping as he watched snow pile past the window panes until the fence posts disappeared beneath white drifts. Her Bible lay on the bedside table, its pages worn from daily reading. Jack picked it up, his calloused fingers finding the silk bookmark she'd placed. His voice, rough from disuse, filled the quiet cabin as he read Psalms and Proverbs, letting the familiar words wash over them both. When her fever finally broke on the second evening, Mabel's eyes fluttered open. "I had such a strange dream," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "The Lord asked if I would choose love, even knowing it might not be returned." Jack's hands trembled as he took hers. "You never needed to wonder about that," he said softly. "I've cared for you since that first morning I found my shirt mended on the fence." Outside, the storm cleared like a veil lifting. Morning sunlight sparkled across the pristine snow, turning the world diamond bright and new. In that clean light, they found their truth at last. Through knee-deep snow, the mail sledge made its way to the cabin, bells jingling. The preacher climbed down, his face bright with news. He clutched a stack of papers in his mittened hands. "It's all been cleared up," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Found the original death notice from 5 years back. Henry Ruth passed in a Kansas mining accident. That telegram was an old one, misfiled and sent by mistake." Jack's heart leaped. He reached for Mabel's hands, tears freezing on his cheeks even as laughter bubbled up from deep inside him. Mabel's own eyes shone with joy and relief. "Now then," the preacher said, warming himself by the stove, "we'll need to do this properly. Full ceremony on Sunday with all the townsfolk as witnesses." That evening, while stars pricked through clearing skies, Jack climbed onto the little church's roof with his tools. The familiar rhythm of hammer on nails steadied his grateful heart. Through the windows below, he could hear Mabel in the church kitchen, preparing bread and pies for the coming celebration. Her clear voice lifted in hymns of praise, carrying across the snow-hushed valley. "Amazing Grace," she sang, and Jack found himself humming along, his heart finally at peace. Sunlight streamed through the church's freshly repaired windows, casting rainbow patterns across the packed wooden pews. The small sanctuary had never held so many people. Townsfolk, squeezed shoulder to shoulder, their Sunday best brightening the usually plain space. Before the altar, Jack stood tall in his cleaned and pressed cavalry coat. His eyes never left Mabel, radiant in a blue calico dress she'd sewn by lamplight. The preacher raised his hands, blessing their joined hearts anew. From the back pew, Wapita and her mother began singing Amazing Grace. The melody rose first in English, then floated heavenward in the gentle rhythms of the Ute tongue. Other voices joined in, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Even the railroad agent, standing near the door, bowed his head and hummed along. After the final Amen, Mabel moved through the crowd with her basket of fresh bread. She offered pieces to everyone, ranch hands and merchants, settlers and native families, the wealthy and the poor. Tears of joy traced down her cheeks as she served, each piece a communion of forgiveness and new beginnings. The morning light caught the silver dollar pinned to Jack's lapel, the same one that had bought him not just a wife, but redemption itself. Spring painted the valley in soft greens and wild yellows. The warm breeze carried hope as new life burst from every corner of the ranch. Jack and Mabel worked side by side, rebuilding the barn that lightning had claimed last winter. Their shared labor turned tragedy into blessing. The new structure would store grain for the valley's widows, ensuring no family went hungry. In town, Mabel's reputation grew sweeter than her famous apple pies. The general store now carried Mrs. Boone's recipe collection, with every penny funding hot meals at the mission's orphan table. The same men who once mocked her size now removed their hats as she passed, respect replacing cruel laughter. Jack hired Ute workers from Wapita's village, paying them the same wages as any other ranch hand. Their skilled work and knowledge of the land earned admiration throughout the territory. One evening, as sunset painted their cabin walls golden, Jack set down his fork during supper. "Been thinking," he said quietly. "Want to deed half the ranch in your name, legal and proper." Mabel reached across the table, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Then it's ours," she replied softly, "both in soil and in spirit." The simple truth of her words settled over them like a blessing, as natural as the spring rain that brought life to their shared land. Weeks drifted by like cottonwood seeds on the breeze. The ranch settled into the kind of peace that comes after long storms, when even the smallest moments feel touched by grace. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild roses that Mabel had planted along the fence, their delicate blooms nodding in the gentle wind. Inside their cabin, the lamplight cast warm shadows across the wooden floors Jack had laid himself. Mabel sat in her rocking chair, the one Jack had surprised her with on her birthday, her nimble fingers working at some mending. The steady rhythm of her needle matched the creak of her chair, a gentle back and forth that spoke of home and comfort. Jack hunched over his workbench near the hearth, his strong hands moving with careful precision as he repaired an old saddle. The leather was worn, but good. Like many things in their life, it just needed patience and care to be made whole again. Every now and then, he would glance up at Mabel, catching the way the lamplight turned her hair to spun gold. The familiar sound of the church bell floated across the valley, its clear tone carrying on the evening breeze. The same bell that had tolled for their second wedding now rang for evening prayers, reminding everyone in the valley of God's constant presence. Its sound seemed to wrap around their cabin like a blessing. Mabel set aside her stitching, folding the fabric with careful hands. "Shall we step out?" she asked, her voice soft with contentment. Jack nodded, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on the cloth tucked in his belt. Together, they walked onto their porch, the wooden boards solid beneath their feet. The sun hung low on the horizon, a great golden disk sinking behind the purple mountains. Light spilled across the valley, painting everything in shades of rose and amber. Their land stretched out before them, green pastures dotted with cattle, the new barn standing proud against the darkening sky. Swallows darted through the evening air, their wings catching the last rays of sunlight as they swooped and dove. Their joyful flight traced patterns against the pink-stained clouds, nature's own celebration of another day well lived. Jack's hand found Mabel's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. The touch brought back memories of that first day at the auction, when he had reached for her trembling hand and led her through the jeering crowd. "They laughed when I bought my bride," Jack said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. The words held no bitterness now, only wonder at how God's plans unfold in unexpected ways. Mabel turned to him, her eyes shining with tears and starlight. Her smile held all the wisdom and love that had transformed their lives and their community. "But God wasn't laughing, Jack," she said softly. "He was planting." The truth of her words settled over them like evening dew. God had indeed been planting love where there had been loneliness, hope where there had been despair, and community where there had been division. Their marriage had grown like a strong tree, putting down deep roots and offering shelter to others. Their clasped hands tightened, neither needing to speak as they watched the sun sink lower behind the mountains. The world felt quiet and whole, as if everything had finally found its proper place. Even the evening breeze seemed to whisper of contentment, stirring the grass and carrying the distant lowing of cattle. More swallows darted overhead, their wings cutting dark silhouettes against the deepening sky. The church bell tolled once more, its sound rolling across the peaceful valley. In that moment, all the struggles and doubts they had faced seemed small compared to the blessing they had found in each other. The light faded slowly from pink to purple. stars beginning to peek through the darkening canopy above. Yet Jack and Mabel remained on their porch, their shared silence more eloquent than words. Their love had grown from necessity into something profound and true, nurtured by faith and watered with mercy. Their ranch stood as testament to what God could do with willing hearts, a place where widows found bread, where different peoples worked side by side in respect, where love had transformed mockery into blessing. Each sunset brought them closer to understanding that their union had been part of a greater plan all along. As darkness settled over the land like a gentle blanket, the peace in their hearts remained unshaken. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a living reminder of God's grace. Their story had become more than they could have imagined that day at the auction. It had become a song of redemption, sung in the language of daily love and constant faith. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.